Hi, my name is Casey Hersch. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and founder of LightYourSparkle.life. Today I'm speaking with a very special guest, Dr. David Feinstein. David Feinstein is a clinical psychologist who has received 9 national awards for his books on consciousness and healing. He has served as faculty at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and with his wife, Donna Eden, has built the world's largest organization teaching energy medicine. I reached out to Dr. Feinstein because, as you know, I have a history of trauma along with Crohn's disease. I believe in integrative methods of healing and have used energy methods to improve my health for years. However, as a therapist, I didn't know about the field of energy psychology until several years ago. I was missing a critical piece of healing available to me and my clients. So today I'm eager to learn about energy psychology and how it can help us. Hello, Dr. Feinstein.
Hello, Casey. Nice to be here with you.
Thank you. Nice to have you. So let's just get started. Can you tell us, what is energy psychology?
What is energy psychology? It's a good question because it confuses a lot of people. What is energy? What's that got to do with psychology? You see EFT where people are tapping on acupuncture points on the skin. What is happening there? And it's been a very interesting evolution for me because it seems so outside of the box of conventional therapy. And I came, as you mentioned, from a very conventional background. And so when I was introduced to this, I was pretty skeptical. Mm-hmm. But what I've come to understand is that these acupuncture points are able to send signals to the brain that either activate or deactivate very specific brain areas. And so if you are in fear, if you are in panic, if you are angry, and you send deactivating signals to the parts of the brain that produce anger or fear or depression, then you are really making a very rapid shift in what the person is experiencing. Now, that's not all that's involved in this therapy, but that's the piece that really makes it unique. It really distinguishes it from most other approaches. Now, other body-based approaches like EMDR and somatic experiencing are also on a similar track of figuring out ways to work with the body and the way the body stores memories, the way the body stores emotion. And it's much harder to just talk about that and make real change than if you have interventions that can make those changes. So energy psychology is a systematic way of, energy psychology is an addition to other types of therapy that systematically shift the deeply coded emotional learnings, that shift the immediate reactions, the emotional reactions, the bodily reactions, the sensory reactions. And so for me, it's become a really very significant tool in terms of helping people. It really speeds things up and lets you reach people that you wouldn't reach otherwise. So that's at least a starting definition for our discussion, and I'm sure we'll expand on that more as we go along.
Well, it sounds like it takes advantage of the neuroplasticity. We hear a lot about that word. That's a really popular word right now, and that it's really comforting for clinicians and also clients to realize that our brain can change and there's ways to reprogram it. So is it correct if I'm saying that this is a way of actually reprogramming the brain in a way that is more balanced?
Very, very much, because up to a few decades ago, the belief was that what you learned in childhood was pretty much what you were stuck with for your whole life in terms of the deepest themes. We believed that brain injuries were permanent, that you could not shift those. But neuroplasticity is, as you are pointing out, the key for giving us confidence that we can produce deep, lasting change. And that's, you know, that's what's really exciting right now about the field of psychology. Is it's not just helping people to feel better temporarily, it's really helping them to make changes that let them build more constructive lives, that help them to build lives that are richer and more deeply gratifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and can you give an example of a situation where you would use energy psychology in treatment of one of your clients?
Well, I'll tell you the first time I ever saw an energy psychology session. Um, I was co-teaching a workshop that was on energy medicine with my wife, Donna Eden, who that's her area, and we often teach together. And this was around 2001, and I'd heard of energy psychology, but I really, you know, I thought, come on, tapping on these points, what's that really going to do? It just looks ridiculous, and there's no explanation of why it would work that was around then. And back then, there was not even any research that showed that it worked. So in 2001, but since I was a psychologist and since I was working with Donna, who worked with energy, people were asking me if I knew about energy psychology, and I didn't. So an opportunity came in one of the cities that we were teaching, a weekend workshop, and one of the participants was a psychologist. And she told me that her psychology group, local psychology group, meets once a month. And it was a meeting that Sunday night, and I was still going to be in town. And would I like to come as her guest? Because the topic was tapping on acupuncture points.
Mm-hmm.
And so I figured, okay, it's time for me to learn something about this. So off I go. And the way the evening was set up was that nobody knew about tapping, but one of the therapists had gotten training in thought field therapy, the original modality for energy psychology. And he was going to demonstrate it. So the month before, he had asked if one of the other psychologists had a client that they were not making progress with, and that he would work with them using this new method. So one of the psychologists did indeed bring in a woman who had a lifelong phobia of enclosed places, claustrophobia. She couldn't go in an elevator. She couldn't, if she had to go under a tunnel, it was a major problem for her. She had to look at those trucking maps to see where the tunnels were and avoid them. It really impacted her life. And she had been through several rounds of therapy, and nobody had made any progress with her. So the room, it was in somebody's house. There was about a dozen psychologists, and we were in a circle, couches and chairs, and they set it up so that the woman and the therapist that was the tapper got in the middle. So everybody was kind of fishbowl style. And he starts asking her some questions, and I'm very comfortable with this. You know, he's asking her about the history, about the therapy that she's done before, and okay, this all makes sense to me. This is how you start a therapy session. And then he asked her to imagine herself in an elevator and give a rating of 0 to 10 of how much distress it caused for her to imagine it. Now we know that imagination can activate the very same parts of the brain that actually being in the situation can activate, and I was very comfortable with that because I had done systematic desensitization, which goes back to Joseph Opie and actually uses that exact same way of assessing a person's subjective experience in the moment. It's called SUDS, subjective units of distress. So she, you know, so it's a 10 for her as she goes into it, and that's fine. But then they start doing these strange incantations, tapping on the skin while saying fear of elevators. And I think, come on, you know, that's not going to work. That's just kind of, you know, tapping, you know, it's just kind of repeating this problem. It's like it's making it deeper. It's making it more of a problem. Fear of elevators, just reinforcing that fear. And And then they did these strange things with eye movements, and you know, it just looked like so much hocus pocus, humming, and all that just looked very strange. But after about just a couple of minutes of this, she goes back into her fantasy of the elevator, and it's gone down a little bit. It's gone down to 7. So I'm kind of watching, and I think, well, these things do shift a bit from time to time. And then she does another round. It goes down to a 5. Whoa, what's going on here? And I'm thinking, well, maybe it's what's called the Stockholm effect, where the person identifies with the person that's doing this torture to them, and wants and doesn't want, and so maybe she just didn't want to embarrass him in front of his colleagues, and so she's just kind of faking it. And then another round of tapping, and boom, it's gone back up to 7. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, these are just normal fluctuations. I knew it wasn't going to work. But the therapist says, well, when you went back into the scene this time, what was the scene? Was it the same elevator? And she says, no, actually, I went back to a memory of when I was a little girl, maybe 8 or so. And I haven't had this memory forever. I just totally had forgotten it. But my 2 older brothers and I were playing with some of their friends with a big carton, like what you would have a refrigerator in. And one of them would get in it and the others would push them. And it was just great fun. And then when it was her turn, they pushed the carton up against a wall with the open end against the wall, and she couldn't get out. And they just all left and kind of left with derisive laughing. And she was terrified. And she was screaming, and because of her weight on the box, she was just stuck. She couldn't maneuver her way out. And she didn't know how long she was in there, but it was pretty clear that that was the root of her claustrophobia. And so I'm thinking, oh, okay, this is good. I somehow, you know, something in the tapping kind of opened up this memory. You know, in energy psychology, they call it peeling away the layers of the onion. And she was able to access this formative memory. And so now the original therapist is going to be able to work with her for a couple of years, talking about her resentment towards her brother, how betrayed she felt, all of those things. And eventually maybe the fear will subside. But that's not what happened. The therapist just didn't miss a beat, just said, okay, let's tap on that. So he starts tapping on this memory and the trauma around this memory and the resentment towards the brothers. And because you can do a round of tapping very quickly, you can get to many of what are called aspects of a situation, such as resentment towards the brother, such as sense of betrayal, and as well as the actual traumatic experience. So each of these he's able to bring down to 0 pretty rapidly, just one at a time, boom, 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 boom. And then she returns to the elevator, and it's back to a 5. And very quickly, with a few more rounds of tapping, it's down to 0. No fear at all. And so, you know, so we're a bunch of psychologists, and so we are interested in testing things. And there's a hall closet that, you know, coat closet in this home. And so we ask her to step into it. And the therapist that's done the tapping is very sensitive. He tells her she doesn't have to, you know, try to prove anything or re-traumatize herself, that as soon as she feels the least little bit of anxiety, she opens the door and steps out. So in she goes, and she is in there, and we're waiting. And, you know, you can imagine a dozen psychologists hovered around this closet door, waiting and waiting and waiting. And it was like about, I don't know, 5 minutes. It was like a long time. And finally the therapist knocks and says, "Are you okay in there?" And she comes out and she is triumphant. She's just never had this experience in her memory that she was able to be in a dark, closed space, narrow space, and feel fine. And everybody's kind of, you know, saying congratulatory things. For me, I'm thinking, I see what's going on. This is a social psychology experiment to see how gullible psychotherapists can be. But it wasn't. It turns out that we get that kind of quick response all the time to what are called simple conditioned responses. She had the things that are enclosed were a trigger for the conditioned response, which was what happened way back when in the box, even though she couldn't remember that. But that was the association that her brain made. If something is closed in, it's terrifying. Things are really terrifying. And that's what got unhooked. And you can do that pretty quickly with a simple trauma. You can do that pretty quickly with a simple phobia. You can do that pretty quickly with many, many other kinds of conditioned responses, which, if you really look deeply, they are at the root of many of the psychological problems that people bring into your office. So that's an example of the use of energy psychology.
That's a great story, Dr. Feinstein, because I think there's just so much skepticism about these approaches, and it's nice to see. I came upon energy methods because I was really sick and I needed to try things to help me get better. So that I was very open, very, very open, and I saw results immediately. But a lot of my colleagues, you know, when you share these stories with them about things that have worked, they say, yeah, I don't know. There's no evidence. It seems a little, like you were saying, a little woohoo, but we know it's real. We know it works. And it's fantastic that I love how you came into this field through also sharing some doubts and then having it show up and show to you just how effective it can be. So for those who are skeptical, are there any studies that support the role of energy psychology in healing?
Well, when I went to that psychologist meeting, there were 0 studies. There were no clinical trials that demonstrated that it works. Mm-hmm. Now, 20 years later, there are more than 120 clinical trials, peer-reviewed in journals, that show that this is effective with a wide range of conditions and that it works quite quickly. So in terms of science, these studies are still early. They're still, it's still a relatively new area of investigation. There are many questions that still need to be investigated, but still 120 studies that all point in the same direction is something to pay attention to. And one of the criticisms of the studies has been that the research design was not very strong, because often they were not funded, often they were therapists who were not experts in doing research who just wanted to prove it, and so they create a study. And they were okay, but they really didn't stand up to real hard criticism. But what's happened more recently is that as we are starting to get more well-designed studies coming out of universities, they're showing the same rapid effects. So there really is going to be a body of knowledge that is able to back up the clinical reports that we're getting. And it's, it's not like the psychotherapy establishment has embraced it. The American Psychological Association's clinical guidelines still don't mention energy psychology, but the public is embracing it. It's very interesting. All of the famous people like Madonna and Whoopi Goldberg and the Duchess of Windsor, who have all publicly given credit to energy psychology for helping them with phobias, and that's combined with a massive popular interest. The Tapping Solution does an annual conference that's online, and for 11 years now, every year they have had at least 500,000 people participate in that. So that's unprecedented in terms of anything else I know of on the pop psych field of the psychology self-help methods. To have 500,000 people, this last year just ended a couple of weeks ago, had 600,000. So it's also growing. So so you have all that happening on one side. On the other side, the psychotherapy establishment is saying it can't work because there's no explanation for how this could work. So that's where it gets stuck. There are explanations, however, but they've not been looked at by the psychotherapy establishment for the most part.
Well, and I think it's just really empowering too. I mean, people really love when they can learn a technique that helps them feel like they can get better and they're a participant in it. And they've learned a set of skills that they don't just have to utilize when they're in an office with a clinician. They can use these skills outside. And for me, that's something that I really love about energy approaches, because you can learn these things and you can also feel empowered over your own situation as these responses to day-to-day life come up and as memories come up. And, you know, I really believe trauma is trapped and held in the body, and movement and somatic treatments and energy methods are critical to healing versus some of the more conventional treatments. So I'm curious, Dr. Feinstein, what's your perspective on what happens to the body when there is a trauma? And why do you feel these other approaches are so important?
Well, about 30 years ago, Bessel van der Kolk wrote a paper called, in the Harvard Psychiatry Review, called "The Body Keeps the Score." And it was about exactly what you're asking, is how trauma gets encoded in the body. And particularly, it actually gets encoded in the entire body. There are muscle memories of the trauma. There are a lot of ways that trauma is in there, but most important for energy psychology and for psychotherapy is the way that it gets coded in the limbic system. So that when there is a memory that corresponds with the traumatic event, it activates in the brain the same responses as when the traumatic event was occurring. And this can be very intense. And it also, when the trauma is unresolved, it will send sensations or emotions where you don't even know that the trauma is being activated. You just feel scared. You don't know why. Or you just feel angry. You don't know why. And so all that is going on beneath consciousness. But it's a physical reality. It's not just a thought or fantasy. It's real. And there's no, and so the therapies that try to address this by talking about it are not effective at reaching that somatic level, at getting, I mean, I don't want to make too blanket a statement, because a really skilled therapist can get the person back into the emotion and really bring them into some true healing. But working at the somatic level, sending acupuncture signals to the parts of the brain that are relevant for the trauma, is a much quicker, more direct way of handling it. And it almost feels like cheating. It almost feels too fast that how did that therapist that had been working with that woman for many, many sessions feel to see her phobia dissolve in a few minutes, after a few minutes session? That's a real cognitive dissonance for therapists. You don't have a framework for interpreting that yet. That is what we are on the cusp of seeing. I think it's on the cusp for the field. I think that more and more therapists are learning this. More and more therapists will be using it. But right now, it's as I said, it's still not. It's not part of the language of the American Psychological Association when they talk about clinical guidelines.
Yeah, and when I first read Dr. Vanderkolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, not only the title resonated with me because for my lifetime I've always known, but never had validated that my physical symptoms in my gut with Crohn's disease were connected to traumatic events that happened in my life. And the the medical repercussions of knowing this information, it's astonishing because a lot of my physical symptoms are rooted in emotional reactions that I have from the past and present triggers. So have you seen in your work, and also are you using energy psychology to help people with chronic health conditions, maybe autoimmune illnesses, other types of chronic conditions?
Yes, absolutely. I just want to give a shout out for the book you just mentioned, which was the follow-up to that paper, and it used the same title, and it was probably the first psychiatry book to ever make it onto the New York Times bestseller list. I mean, it's a fantastic book, and it really maps what we're talking about. So this will be just a very small little summary of it. But yes, a way to say it is that in Donna's training of the energy medicine practitioners who are working largely with physical illness, one of the things that we've recognized is that if you're using the correct techniques and the person gets stuck, often what will really turn it around is to go to traumatic events in the person's past. And those traumas are often, right, like you said, at the root, not always, but they're often at the root of an autoimmune disorder, or at the root of a variety of physical difficulties. And then if you can resolve that with the tapping, if you can resolve that by focusing directly on that trauma, you are able then to see breakthroughs in the physical condition. It really helps move things along. And there's a variety of research that talks about that shows improvements with the tapping with fibromyalgia, with frozen shoulder, with various kinds of chronic pain, with a range of physical disorders, arthritis, that you wouldn't really think that you'd go to a psychologist for those, because they are so real in the physical realm. They can be diagnosed. They're not psychosomatic in the sense of the person is just imagining the discomfort. They are very real, but you go in and you work at the level of the emotions. And even if trauma was not at the root, any time that someone has a chronic illness, there's a lot of emotion about that. There's emotion about being less able to be at your fullest capacity. There's anger, there's depression, so not only going to the traumatic event or the formative event, if there is one, it's also working with the other emotions that kind of keep the illness locked in. They keep the person feeling hopeless. They keep the person feeling pessimistic, and that makes it more difficult to move forward.
Yeah, and I think the idea that the stress response that happens in our bodies as a result of trauma and how that gets programmed in to our system when other stresses, like the current stress right now with the coronavirus, it's a trauma trigger for people who have had chronic illness, and then there's this potential to get sick again. So that inflammation that goes into this feedback loop triggered by past events and current events becomes a very real physical set of conditions. And I love that the work that you're doing and Donna and Dr. Vanderkolk are integrating the physical and the emotional, because for a patient, myself, and also a clinician, this is an essential integration. for people to really get well. So I just, my heart beams when I know that this work is happening out there, because it just gives me so much hope and hope for other people. So, thank you. And, this being said, there are a number of non-licensed therapists who are using energy methods to help their clients heal from trauma and illness. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about the use of energy psychology with non-licensed professionals?
Yes, that's an excellent question because it's very tricky. You have a method that a life coach can use that is going to help a business person overcome their blocks to success, that is going to help a parent be less reactive to their kids, that is going to help in so many areas of life. And it's a powerful tool. So it becomes very tempting for people who are working at that kind of life coach level to move it into working with more severe psychological difficulties. And it's a very fine line, because the person doesn't come into your office with a sign that says, I am a trauma victim, handle with care. They come in looking like everybody else. So what we teach is, for every unlicensed practitioner that we teach, the Association of Comprehensive Energy Psychology has two tracks. They have a training track for professionals, and they have a training track for people that are not licensed. And so one of the first things is, if you're not licensed, form a relationship with somebody who is, with a licensed mental health professional who is able to be on the phone with you to, if you say, I have this new client and and I'm a little concerned, what do you think? And they may say, well, see how it goes, or they may say, here's the cautions to take, or they may say, wow, refer. And so that's a very basic step, and you want to do that anyway. If you're operating in a small town, a big city, you want to know who are the mental health resources that you can count on, and they're going to be happy to meet with you. Invite them out to lunch, or bring a brown bag in for their lunch, so that you have a face-to-face connection. They get a sense of who you are, you get a sense of who they are, so that when it comes time to talk about a client, you've got something established. And they'll be happy to do that, because you're going to be a referral source for them. So that's one step that you can take. Another step is to really inform yourself about the signs of an abreaction. Inform yourself about the signs of someone going into an extreme stress reaction, and have a plan of what you do if and when that happens. Because your job is not to bring them into that kind of reaction, but it happens. You may be tapping on something that seems really innocent, a time their mother criticized them, and then a memory comes up that, oh my gosh, the next thing that happened was that my father beat me to a pulp. And then they're totally in that experience, and as you don't know what to do. And so it's re-traumatizing to them if you can't help them get out of it. And so we teach people to recognize the signs of when someone's going into a stress reaction, and immediately, rather than do what a therapist might do, which is to explore that, to probe it more, immediately use techniques that are calming, that calm the nervous system, that calm the limbic system, that calm the body. And we have those. We have those with tapping. Energy medicine has lots of them, which Donna has several times been a keynote at the ACEP conference, where she teaches the psychology, the psychotherapists, these simple techniques for calming the body, so that you calm the person. Then when they're out of it again, when they're out of that stress response, then you can do some problem solving, which might include talking about a referral, talking about bringing them to, either stopping their work with you and going to see so-and-so, or continuing to work hand in hand, get the release form so that you can be in communication with the therapist. So those are all things that we teach. And so to your question, yes, this is a problem because not everyone is responsible in training people these new methods. They're so fancy and they're so exciting, and so there's a lot of enthusiasm in teaching them. The cautions are often not put out. So it's I think it's a matter of ethics to really, if you're training people in this, to also be training them in the scope of practice, the limits of what someone that is not trained can do. Now, do I believe that a person has to be licensed to be effective? I don't. I think that there are unlicensed people who have in other ways really developed these skills, really developed the capacity to work effectively with people that are traumatized. But that is not a given. That is something that is earned. That is something that's really cultivated in whatever way they happen to cultivate it. But generally, people that are licensed have at least a minimum amount of training in all of this.
And I think that's important, Dr. Feinstein. What you're talking about with the training that you and Donna do is that you have these steps that take into consideration the person's background, because you acknowledge that there are some of these approaches that people can access more mainstream. They can buy books, they can self-teach, and they can learn how to do these energy methods. But without that background in trauma, they're entering sometimes an arena where they don't know if they're going to access something within the client that is a surprise, something they haven't faced before. I'm in an interesting position, I feel, because as a therapist, I understand the ethics from my professional training. But as a patient, I've explored many different energy methods, and something that's bothered me through the years is that when I was experiencing an energy approach by someone who wasn't a licensed therapist, trauma would sometimes get accessed in my body that I wasn't aware that was there. And sometimes the approach would be, or the answer would be, when I would put a stop on it, I'd say, I don't know if I'm ready to go with this, or I'd feel that reaction in my body, like some adrenaline and that stress response that I'm keenly aware of because of my training. Sometimes the response I would be given is, well, if you use these energy approaches and ask the body, and the body says it's okay to proceed, then we can trust the body and we can proceed. And I'm wondering, is that something that you've heard people say, or does that have any meaning to you when I describe it this way?
Well, it's a little tricky because when you ask the body, you really need to know which voice the body is answering you with. So people use energy testing sometimes to determine whether or not to proceed in that situation. And I don't trust that completely. I trust energy testing in a lot of ways, but I don't trust it asking that kind of a question. Because energy testing is really designed to determine if the energies are flowing through a particular muscle that is that anatomically it corresponds with the meridian that's being tested. So that I trust, that yes, the energy is flowing through, or no, the energy isn't. That's solid. But I think that to tune into the body and really sense what's going on is not leading the witness. That asking the question leads the witness a little bit to have the person really describe what's going on and sense where the tightnesses are, sense what what sensation is leading to fear that maybe is saying no, or what part of them is wanting to show the therapist how brave they are. There's so many pieces to it, but so if you're going to ask the body questions, I wouldn't just ask it as a yes no question. I would go deeper into it so that the full experience is able to be registered, and then proceed from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what you were saying earlier about having the clinicians understand what to look for when a stress response happens, and then having these tools that they can draw from immediately to help calm the person's nervous system. I mean, that to me is a perfect balance of how to protect the clients and the clinicians, and to create a safe environment for the processing of the trauma, because you don't always know what you're going to get when you're in a session, just like the example you gave at the beginning where the person's talking about this fear of being in closed spaces, but then it goes back to some other memories of other events that have happened. So do you have a sense of how we can protect clients so they know what they should look for when they are seeking out these energy methods or want to find a therapist who can do energy psychology with them?
Right. Well, one approach is to find clinicians, find practitioners who have been certified by one of the major organizations that we know to be really solid, such as ASAP or EFT Universe, or the EFT group in England, EFT International. Those groups have certification programs. Our friend Fred Gallo has a certification program. So on our website, if you go to Energy Psych Ed, Energy PSYCHED.com, energypsyched.com, and go to resources, and then under resources go to practitioners. We have lists of the organizations I just mentioned and others which have where you can search by geography to find a practitioner that they've certified. So that's so that information is available on the web. So that's one way to do it. It doesn't guarantee that every therapist that's been certified by these organizations is completely competent or ethical, but it's a start. And often these organizations will also give some guidelines to the questions that you're asking, or you ask the therapist. You just get the person's. I mean, generally the listings will give the person's email address, and just write to them and say, I have a history of trauma, and I'm concerned about having a therapist that's really well informed and well trained in working with trauma. Can you tell me about your background in those ways, so that there's a certain buyer beware process in this, but the information's available. There's a good therapist out there for anybody that really wants it.
Great. That's, yeah, and knowing where to go to look up the professional certifications and the training, and having that be a guide for where a person starts, and then they can go directly to different clinicians that might seem appealing, write them, and have that conversation, so that the consumer is the one that is checking in with themselves also to see if there's a right fit. I think we sometimes forget that we have choices with who we choose, and just because we try, one clinician or a professional or a healer, we think, okay, well, that's it. No, we're in charge of picking the right fit. And I know in social work, in my training, we really stress how important it is to find that fit and to do your own research and advocate for yourself to find someone that's going to provide services that feel comfortable. And if something doesn't feel right, that it's important to listen to that.
Exactly.
So I guess in a perfect world, we'd have more integration between psychology and conventional medicine. Do you have any suggestions about how we could have these energy methods more integrated?
Well, in quantum physics, when in the early days, when they were trying to bring quantum physics to Newtonian physicists, and there were just walls up, just lots of walls. The conventional wisdom was that old paradigms die one funeral at a time, and there's a resistance to these techniques, particularly because they look strange and because they don't have an explanatory basis that is, that's widely accepted. So there is so what I'm seeing is that the younger therapists, the younger doctors, are more open than the older ones, as a generalization. So there's a certain evolution that's happening in that way. Now I must admit, I've been surprised. And as I said, in 2001, there was no research. And so the, gatekeepers of conventional psychotherapy were saying, well, get some research and then we'll talk to you. And so we did. We got the research. We got a lot of studies, 120 clinical trials that all show that it works. And it's still not part of that mainstream that you're talking about. There's still, when people go into surgery, they are not routinely told to tap about their fears, to tap to increase their immune response, to tap on visions of the surgery going perfectly. They're not told to do that. They're not told to bring in energy medicine to really get all the energy systems balanced before the surgery, then have the surgery, then have all the energy systems balanced again. That level of interchange isn't there yet, but in pockets, it's starting to happen. You see hospitals now that are routinely bringing Reiki masters in to work with the patients. You're seeing our work has gone into some cancer hospitals for people to help with side effects of radiation and chemotherapy. You see movement happening. So I think that as long as it's solid as it is, this will continue to infiltrate. But I wish I had good answer to that question of how to make it go faster, because we've been trying for 20 years to do that, and it's it's slow pushing.
Yeah, and I feel like in my case, I wish that everyone who was diagnosed with something like Crohn's disease would see these energy methods as a primary mode of treatment. And I always tell people, you have nothing to lose. It's not going to harm you. And you might potentially be able to avoid, as in my case, having surgery. I mean, certain decisions that I've been able to make because I've had access to these methods have helped me not only continue to get better every year of my life, but to also not have to go down the road of having to take the immunosuppressant drugs and also having surgery. But there's also been a huge acknowledgement of the connection between trauma and that I'm not just a physical person. I have this emotional component that's been a really big piece of healing. So I agree with you. We're not there yet, but we're going to get there eventually.
Well, and part of it is doing what you're doing, is talking it up. You're an example. You're a case study. And that's what Donna does also. She healed herself of multiple sclerosis. And so she talks about that and letting that be seen and known until the research gets there. There's no funding for the research. So the research has been slow so far, but doing what you're doing, really, God bless you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's deeply important to me to share my story and to help people just through one other person's story, maybe there's a little piece of information that might connect that helps them make the next steps. And I feel like you're right. The more we share stories about how this works for people, regardless of what the statistics and the evidence-based research says, we know that that exists. But even if they don't see that, people, when they know that they feel better and they feel like they've got some empowerment over their health, that goes everywhere. So Dr. Feinstein, I know our time is limited and it's been fantastic, speaking with you today. I've learned a lot. You've brought up some really important points, and, I really appreciate the work you're doing and Donna Eden's work. You guys are truly pioneers, powerhouses in the field, and I'm just really honored that you spent some time with me today.
Thank you, Casey. It's been a pleasure.